public transport is something I think we can all agree is not perfect, despite trains being objectively awesome. And I think it's easy to agree that public transport should be better, but today we're going to get into the specifics of what the goals of a public transport system should be, where the current system is falling short, and how we can realistically improve the role that public transport plays in people's lives. One of the reasons I chose this topic for today is the recent announcement by West Australian Premier Roger Cook saying that public transport will be free from Christmas Day to January 28th. That includes buses, trains, and even ferries. The state government has justified this decision by calling it a form of cost of living relief and saying that because during the Christmas period, ridership is usually quite low, they have the capacity to offer free rides. Now, this decision and reasoning is fairly sound in my opinion, but as with all government policy, the devil is in the details. And for us to fully understand the good and the bad of moving towards free public transport, before we look deeper into this policy, we're going to go take a look at somewhere else that's implemented free public transport on a more nationwide context to get an understanding of how that policy realistically plays out. And that brings us to Luxembourg. Yes, Luxembourg, a place with a lot of castles, apparently. But nevertheless, they made public transport free for all on the 29th of February, 2020. So they've had 3.5 years of this policy, and we're going to take a look at what we might be able to learn from our Luxembourgian cousins. A big benefit brought from free public transport is the economic relief that it brings a lot of riders. That can include workers, students, caregivers, and even unemployed workers who are now able to freely travel throughout their community without having to pay. It removes economic barriers, particularly for young people, students, the elderly, and people with disabilities. In addition to the economic benefits that public transport brings, it also begins to be seen by the general public as something of a civil right. It strengthens people's belief in government's ability to actually materially improve the conditions for the public. People begin to see not having to pay for public transport as a freedom, and they see the ability to travel within their community as a right. And that cultural shift in how a country views its public transport system is emblematic of what's happened in Luxembourg. Ultimately, not that much has changed apart from things on the margins. Public transport is free for anyone, including tourists, which means ridership is higher, meaning plenty of people reduce their carbon footprint and make a free trip that they otherwise might not have been able to. And while traffic hasn't reduced by all that much, meaning the environmental implications aren't really all they're cracked up to be, it's because of a shift in ridership. The people who will be taking public transport are likely to not have any other options. And the people who end up driving their car are those who can afford to do that. Effectively, you're putting less of a squeeze on those who otherwise couldn't afford to be able to travel throughout their community. And while more buses and more trains can help ease traffic and congestion, generally the way people see their new reality is a matter of more freedom and more choice as opposed to less. And finally, the last Luxembourgian thing we're looking at today is their initiative aims specifically at accessibility to help riders with disabilities. And they do this with something they call Adapto, which is an objectively hilarious name, but it seems to be quite a good initiative. So basically, it's a supplementary bus taxi service that's designed specifically for citizens of Luxembourg with a disability. It's designed to be able to provide a door-to-door service, so if you want to make your entire trip using Adapto, you can. But I assume it could also be used as a supplementary trip if you want to go to the train station or to a bus stop, because not a lot of people live in a close, accessible distance from those public services. And I think this is important because public transport is not always very accessible to those with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities. They might have issues in social scenarios. They might get anxious. If they have a physical disability, it might make navigating those public spaces just a lot physically harder. And so services like this, Adapto, are really good at going that extra mile to making sure that everyone has a right and an ability to access public transport. Ultimately, I think what's clear after looking at these policies is that when you treat public transport as a right and an entitlement, what you can do for people is give a whole lot of people choice and options who otherwise wouldn't have had any. And with that, we come back to WA, where it seems like we might be on the brink of passing an actually good policy. But before we fully dissect WA's 2023 public transport approach, I think it might help for us to take a look back at the past of Western Australia's approach to public transport and what we can learn from past policies that we've implemented and how we can go forward keeping those in mind. You see, from the start of the 1900s to the 1950s, all buses in WA were privately operated and run, meaning they cost more to ride and service less areas. But you see, by the 1950s, a lot of those customers that they had been courting had gotten cars and weren't in need of bus travel anymore. So by the end of the 50s, the bus companies in WA, one, weren't able to turn a profit because their customer base was dwindling, and two, were failing to serve the community in a way that public transport should. So what did the government do? Well, they effectively nationalized the bus industry, turning it into what we now know as Transperth. Yes, that is the real name. And this was obviously so the government could fix the prices and ensure that buses actually met people in their communities where they are. I tell you this for two reasons. One, our current airplane industry seems to be in a pretty similar position than our busing industry was in the late 50s. I mean, think about it. For planes that transport passengers within WA, they're expensive for riders, probably not all that profitable for providers, and are they serving the community's needs? Not currently. So Roger, if you're listening, fix the planes, damn it. And the second reason for that little history lesson is that public transport is a public service. If it's failing to serve the public, we can just change the way it works so that it does serve the public. We've done it before, and there is absolutely nothing stopping us from doing it again. It's a matter of politicians having political will. And that finally brings us back to WA's upcoming Summer of Free Public Transport. Now that we've got enough context, we can ask, is this a good policy? In short, kinda. The policy of free public transport for a month is certainly a step in the right direction towards a public transport system that ultimately better serves the public. But if I had to nitpick at it, this is what I'd say. A month? That's it? Only 1 month? Now, I really hope this is like a trial balloon sort of thing. The government clearly seems to think that they can only offer this free public transport because of the usual low ridership over the Christmas period. They're obviously worried about having the capacity to serve more people if public transport is made free. And I understand this hesitance. I think at the end of the day, if you're willing to fund public transport in the way it needs to be funded to serve the public, then capacity shouldn't ultimately be a problem. And like I said, if some people have to drive, it'll be the people who can afford to drive, and people won't be skipping public transport because they just can't afford it. We mentioned disabilities before, so I want you to imagine this for me. You're a wheelchair user and you're trying to go to the train station to catch a train. What is the biggest impediment facing you to get on the train? It's these damn turnstile payment thingies. Like, if you just removed those things from public spaces, they would be way more physically accessible and welcoming to a range of people. People with disabilities, people who have social anxiety, all of these people would find it far easier to access the train station if you just didn't have those payment turnstile thingies. And you see, this policy by the government only applies to citizens with a smart rider card, which is like, it's like our public transport rewards card system, you know? And I don't particularly like that because there are going to be homeless people and poor people and people with disabilities who just don't have smart riders. And so they're kind of implicitly excluded from a policy like this. And I go, okay, if everything's running for free, why do people need to tag on and off? Like, why even make them go through that hassle if no one's paying anything? So my answer would be this: make public transport free permanently. Make it a right and a freedom, and remove all of the barriers, both economic and physical, that prevent certain people, usually the most vulnerable people, from accessing this public service. Now, I want to quickly address some criticisms of free public transport, most of which, in my opinion, come down to free public transport not being funded highly enough. And what I mean by that is in places where they've tried free public transport and it's failed, it's usually been because not enough trains were coming, or the schedules went awry, or people were displeased with the amount of like teenagers and young people that were taking trains that weren't otherwise able to when it was paid. And honestly, I think those criticisms, like I said, it's a matter of just funding the system more so that you don't have train delays, so that you have enough workers to deal with harassment situations and to deal with the riffraff. Like, one criticism of free public transport is reduced revenues from the government. And it's like, yeah, if you don't charge people a tax on something that their taxes have already paid for, then yeah, there's not going to be as much revenue coming into the government. But the effect of what you're doing is you're delivering a service to the public. It might cost a bit of money, but the public is certainly going to benefit from that. And guys, we know in Australia that when we pay for things like submarines or referendums, our taxes don't immediately go up. Government spending and the amount that you get taxed every year is not directly correlated. And I think it's silly for people to say, oh, we can't spend a little bit more to make public transport free. What if my taxes go up? They almost certainly won't. And I don't think they should have to. And on that note, I want to remind you that public transport, transit salaries, train schedules, all this stuff is already organized and paid for before you even get to the train station. And it's paid for with our general tax money. So frankly, I don't see a reason for the government to double dip and charge people extra just for using a service that we've already paid for. Our taxes pay for roads so that people can drive on them without having to pay a fee to some company that owns the road. Let's just treat public transport the same way. We pay for it so everyone can use it for free. And lastly, like on the topic of money spent on these services, think about how much time and money is wasted when transit officers spend who knows how long harassing teenagers and unemployed people to see their train tickets. If that wasn't a part of their job, they would be under less stress. They would have to deal with less rowdy, difficult to deal with passengers. They would just have to focus on making sure all the trains show up and leave when they're meant to. So let's take the pressure off at every level and just make public transport free. Roger, are you listening? You got an election to win, buddy, so just do it. Do something popular, for God's sake. And that is where our video ends. Thank you for sticking around and getting into the nitty-gritty of public transport. I find it to be one of those things that's very ignorable, but also very important. So I'm glad we got to talk about it today. But yeah, there you have it. That's that. I hope you've learned something and thought about something in a slightly different way after hearing my thorough opinions about it. Well, there you have it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.